As an artist, I work in two different mediums mainly. I work as a traditional painter and I paint landscapes and still lifes and flowers using acrylic on canvas or linen. The other way I work is as a digital artist and I work in three-dimensional virtual reality when I do that. And so what you find is that the product of your work is related to the way you work. When I work as a traditional painter, I work with the premise that a good artist sees less. So most of the public would define an artist as an artist. A good artist sees more than the general person. But in my work, I try to see less. So I try to suggest things to people. The ship that comes into Newcastle harbour might be just a slash of red, and then you get a white part for the bridge and then a grey part for the shadow. And if people have seen ships before, then they bring something to the painting and they actually finish the painting off for you. Hopefully most people who see works where you're suggesting things will take away something different. In my digital work, I'm suggesting a narrative. When you suggest a narrative to people, you're telling them that something's happening and you're saying that there's a before and after, and you're just showing them a freeze frame of the narrative. And it's up to the audience to actually look at the narrative or the elements of the digital work and to make the story themselves. All through my life, of course, like most painters, I've always wanted to be an artist, and I promised myself quite early in life that when I got old, I would start painting seriously. And one day I woke up and I was 40, and I decided I better pull my finger out and start doing it seriously. So I'm 61 now, so I've been working pretty hard as an artist for 21 years, and it's an interesting thing to do, especially around Newcastle. The big advantage of doing it around Newcastle is that before it was revitalised, it was a great place for artists because you could afford to. In Newcastle, it was one of those places where it took you longer to starve. Another advantage of painting Newcastle is that I love to paint it, and people in Newcastle love their city and they love to buy scenes in Newcastle. And that's not why I paint them, it's a lucky confluence that the audience is there and that the audience can look at a painting and go, wow, that's the street that I drive down every day when I'm driving into the office, or that's the street where my grandmother was born, for example. I've been to TAFE twice and done a fine art certificate. We were lucky enough to have great teachers. My last teacher was a fellow called Bob Birch, who was very influential in that he would see what you're doing and then bring a book of artists in that would set you on a path. And I think he set me on the path to fauvism. Emotionally, painting high colour paintings all the time, they're quite hard to balance. And so gradually I started working with dark grounds, and I'd paint a dark glaze over the canvas. And it was really interesting because once you've done that, you finish the painting because the painting's there, you've got to tease it out. So the painting exists in that dark glaze, and then you just extract the buildings or the flowers or whatever from that dark glaze. It's great as opposed to a normal way a painter works is you take a white canvas or a canvas that's just got a bit of sienna on it or whatever, and you impose your will on it. And you put lots of pigment on it and you gradually build it up, and you're placing the painting on the canvas, and which is what I do now in the main as the technique that I work with, and that gives you a lot more luminosity because you've got a light canvas behind the work. But going through that period where you're working on a dark ground was really enlightening in a manner of speaking, and that's not a pun. The reason I originally started was because I wanted to tell stories, so I wanted to be an animator. The first thing I did was a 20-minute surfing animation, which was absolutely terrible, but that taught me a lot about modelling in three-dimensional virtual reality. It taught me a lot about timing and also taught me about storytelling. I went from animation storytelling to telling stories in still form, and I started to sit down and tell stories in books. After doing that for several years, I was lucky enough to get an agent in New York called Anna Olswanger. It's quite interesting. There's a few political overtones or undertones in children's books. For example, you don't have anyone who smokes a cigarette, so grandfather can't smoke a pipe. Dogs don't have teeth because teeth are dangerous and can bite little children. A lot of the digital works are quite dark, and the reason for that is one of the things when I first started off doing digital work, I started looking at old-fashioned fairy tales or children's tales, and when you go back to the source of those tales, you'll find that they're originally peasant tales. So you've got people who are living in the forest and they're being surrounded by death. You've got the Black Plague. They're surrounded by wild animals that eat them. They can't let their little kids go out. side, otherwise the kids all disappear, there's a high infant mortality, and so a lot of those original tales are dark because they're there to warn children of what can happen to them. There's the story of a girl who put on some red shoes and she wasn't supposed to put them on, and her punishment was that the red shoes took her dancing, and it took her dancing for miles and miles and miles and miles till her feet bled, and she was dancing and she was exhausted and she was going to die. And luckily a fellow came along with an axe and saw what was happening, so he chopped off her feet. And that's the moral of the story, is don't put on your red shoes when your grandmother tells you not to. So I started off illustrating those old tales and have a lot of fun, because you've got all these poor kids being tortured and it's politically incorrect, but that also makes it fun, and it also gets a dark edge to your work where people have a reaction. I was in a show with Robin Workhoven called Blood recently, and I decided that I would do Goldilocks, and we have this great image of Goldilocks as this nice little fresh-faced girl who breaks into the three bears' house and sits down and eats their porridge and wrecks their bed, etc. But the original story is about a little old lady who breaks into their house and totally trashes it, and the bears take their revenge on her by taking her up to the top of the local church and impaling her on the steeple. So when I read that story, I did an image of Goldilocks lying dead on cobblestones with blood coming out of her head, with the three bears looking on going, basically, what have we done? So that's how I started off doing digital work. And I mean, in some ways the best kind of work is the work that people feel uncomfortable with, because they're likely to sit up and take notice of it and actually spend time with the work. So you reward people by making them uncomfortable. When I approached Maitland Regional about having the Hugo Ball show, because it's a show of digital work which is printed out, they took quite a big risk in showing the work, because it's not what you normally see in an art gallery. But I approached them with the premise that it would be a show that educated people, because one of the premises of the show was that I would seek out forgotten artists. Quite often they were quite famous in their lifetime, and then they lost fame because the next best thing came along. One of the famous artists in his lifetime that comes to mind is Bouguereau, who was a famous French painter, head of the salon in his time, and he was a traditional painter. What happened was the Impressionists came along, and the Impressionists were the big new thing, and the Impressionists could paint quickly, and suddenly they became bankable, because what happened was all the art dealers had all these paintings suddenly to sell. That was one of the premises, to take people like Bouguereau. The other fellow might have been James Ensor, who's well known in Belgium. He influenced the Expressionists and Surrealists dramatically, but a lot of people outside of Belgium have never heard of him, so he was another person I chose for that reason. Bosch, everyone's heard of Bosch, but not everyone's heard of Gustave Doré, who was quite famous printmaker in his time. So I've done a homage to him, of a giant eating lots and lots of food fed to him by little people. There's a fellow called Fuseli who was very famous. He was, I think he was a symbolist, and there's a painting by him where there's this incubus sitting on top of a woman who's either passed out or dead. And an incubus is a devil or a creature that has sex with sleeping women. So he was pretty out there for his time, but as soon as he died, he suddenly lost a lot of his fame, and he was only resurrected probably in the 80s from memory. That was probably the main premise, was education, because it's relating art to the community.
Carawanne by Hugo Ball. Jolly fanto bambla o fally bambla. Grossiga fabla hor. Egiga goramen. Higo bloiko rusula huju. Hollaka hollala.
The Hugo Ball show came about because of basically the Dada movement, and one of the premises of the Dada movement, that all of art and all of society that had gone before was pretty useless and meaningless, and so they decided to invent an art which was meaningless in itself. And ironically, as Dada became more popular, it became a proper art movement. It kind of dissolved in on itself because its original premise had disappeared. So when I read that about the Dada movement, I decided that Hugo Ball, who was the Dadaist movement's annunciator, that we were taking on a metaphorical journey on art history, and we give you a bit of an education. And it's a pretty silly idea, but so is Dadaism, and so is most things in life, so I thought we'd work with that. Initially I decided I might go back to the Lascaux caves. I wanted to do a really long art history tour, Eventually I decided on doing Fra Angelico as the first work. When you're homaging traditional work, it's quite a challenge because it makes you look at the traditional work with a different eye, and you have to go, well, I'm going to try and make that traditional art but in a digital sense, and you have to really sit down and figure out how to do it. The works that I chose were works that made me feel uncomfortable. Works that make you feel uncomfortable, it doesn't matter what area of history you're looking at, they're always relevant to human beings. For example, there's an Arnold Böcklin work, which is a vanitous work where Arnold Böcklin, as the painter, has painted himself with death hanging over his shoulder playing a fiddle. And the vanitous genre of work is where we say that I'm fully aware that I'm going to be dead soon. It's probably worse in the 1890s than it is today because we don't see so much death around us in modern society. The Hugo Ball show is also about appropriation or misappropriation, and it's got a lot of moral connotations because, you know, there's the word stealing, copying, appropriating, misappropriating, borrowing, referencing, but in the end you're always taking someone else's work and calling it yourself in one way or another. So if you think about that and you think about what Andy Warhol did with those newspaper photographs and turned them into silk screens and made lots and lots of money, and I'm sure he didn't ring up the newspaper photographer and say, hey, I'm going to turn your photograph of the electric chair into a piece of art, would you like 10%? Manet, he was a serial misappropriator. There's a painting, something about having a small afternoon, Le Petit, whatever it is, and there's two dressed men and a naked woman in it, and he's taken that, the composition of that from the corner of a Raphael woodcut. And he's also done, he's misappropriated Goya's, I think it's the 8th of May 1888 or 1808, where a fellow's being shot by a bunch of soldiers, and he's turned into his own work and put the Emperor Maximilian in the place of the victim. So I've misappropriated that in turn and made Hugo Ball the victim in that particular work. The definition of an illustration is something that illuminates a narrative, and once you start thinking about imagery in the sense of narratives, you're allowed to have a subplot. And in the works, the Hugo Ball works, and in most of the images, there's I've placed a skull and a rat in different parts of in each image, and the idea is that the skull and the rat play that kind of subplot, but they're also there to reward the viewer. Because if a viewer looks at a few works and suddenly sees that there's a skull and thinks, wasn't there a skull and a rat in that other work? Then they go back and look at the work, and they tend to spend time with the work. And the idea is that you need to reward the viewer. If they spend a lot of time with the work, then you have to give them something in return. And in the digital work, there's a lot of detail, and it's a lot of fun hiding things like the skull and the rat, etc. In a way, you know how witches have familiars, so a witch will have a black cat. Well, they're Hugo Ball's familiars, in that they're doing the travelling with him, and that they're also his witnesses, because what's happening to Hugo Ball in the show, the Enlightening Journey of Mr. Hugo Ball, he's having a lot of horrible things happening to him. He's being shot in one image, he's being drowned in another, he's being eaten in another, and it's probably pretty horrific for him. And so the skull and the rat are there to say, don't worry, Hugo, all those things did happen to you. We were there, we saw it, and we were in the image as well. The reason that I chose to show the works as printed media was not just because they're homages to old masters, and therefore it's mimicking, obviously they're not on canvas, but it's mimicking the fact that they're a two-dimensional object. It is because I think once you start printing work out and putting it behind glass and framing and hanging on a wall, it adds a lot of presence to a work. If I had those images on a television screen or a computer monitor, you'd see a lot more detail, but if you were to see a slideshow of my images flashing in front of you, they would either go too fast or too slow. But once you print them out, put them on the wall, then you're giving the viewer the choice of whether they actually want to stop and look at the work and how long they want to spend with the work. But also they can go to the next image and then go back to the first one because the first one's still there. And I think that's pretty important, that people can have access to an image when they want to, rather than just have it flashed in front of them for 2 seconds and then have something else flashed in front of them. As a 3D virtual reality artist, you're basically working with mathematics, and you're working with different coordinates that define what we call vertices, which are points, and the points are all joined up into lines, and the lines become polygons, which is a many-sided figure, and the polygons wrap around cylinders and become a 3D object. So you're not really working in the same way as you are with paint. You're losing the immediacy of it.